So welcome, everybody. Very glad to see all of you for a special evening with Dr. Stephen Windmueller. Let me give you a little background on him. Dr. Steve Windmueller is an astute analyst of modern day Jewish trends. He's prolific in his writings, and he really gives us a very important perspective on what's going on in the Jewish world. He's the Rabbi Alfred, I think they removed that part of it. He's the Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. And prior to Hebrew Union College, he served on the staff of the American Jewish Committee, directed the Albany Jewish Federation and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. During his tenure at Hebrew Union College, Dr. Windmueller served for 10 years as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. I don't know if you know this, Dr. Windmueller, but our educator and administrator is Andrea McNellis, who's one of your students. And Dr. Windmueller was named to the deanship of the LA campus in 2006 for 4 years. And between 2012 and 2014, he was invited to teach classes both at USC and at the Nanjing University in China. The author of 4 books and numerous articles, Professor Windmueller holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. His articles have appeared in a number of secular and Jewish publications. And during the pandemic, Dr. Windmueller has been devoting his research to examining the impact of the coronavirus on the American Jewish community. Currently, he is editing a volume for USC's Caste Institute on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, which is scheduled for release. I got from the summer of 2021, but you said in December, right?
December.
And Dr. Windmueller also serves as a fellow of the Jerusalem Institute of Public Affairs and as a board member of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles. And for the past 6 years, he's been on the faculty of the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, teaching across the globe. So we are really, really thrilled to have him this evening. And not only that, but he's generously offering this lecture as a free, gratis gift to us. So we're really, really appreciative.
Thank you.
So Dr. Windmueller.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Singer, and to all of you, good evening. And if it is your dinner time, please feel free to eat as we go forward. I'm going to post a PowerPoint, and we'll walk through that for the next 20 to 25 minutes, and then open the conversation for your comments and questions. And I look forward to your input as we take up this topic. So Rabbi, maybe we can post the PowerPoint on anti-Semitism. Indeed, I think we all are aware of the heightened attention to racism, anti-Semitism in the United States today, and the growing concerns about the health and vitality of American democracy in the process. So let's move to the first content slide. I think when we talk about this subject, we need to remind ourselves of the theological and religious context of anti-Semitism, deeply rooted in the history of Western culture, and certainly very much a part of the 19th and 20th century thinking of the Nazis and other groups who translated the ideas of theological anti-Semitism into racist theory and eugenics behavior, if you wish, about anti-Semitic conduct and viewpoints. Indeed, the 1903 publication of the Elders of Zion, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, would contribute a kind of conspiratorial notion to anti-Semitism and the power and role of Jews in controlling the world, which was the thesis or framework of this writing. And indeed, even after the Shoah, even after the Holocaust, we would experience the denial that it even existed and efforts to, in a sense, misrepresent or counter the language and culture of Holocaust literature and reality. With the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, we have seen the rise of what the United Nations would ultimately label in 1976 that Zionism is a form of racism. Of course, that was removed some 20 years later, but nonetheless, it has been allowed to percolate and become part of the framework of actions against Israel, including the rise of the BDS movement, that is basically boycott, divestments, and sanctions directed against the Jewish state, and the creation of the notion that the Jews are the new Zionists, are the new Nazis, and have created in the context of that, the notion of Israel being an apartheid society. But even in the United States today, we see on the right, but also on the left, extremism in various forms. And the framework for much of that is about the question of whether or not Jews who are Caucasian, or mostly, I should say, Caucasian, are really white people at all, which will be part of our conversation as we move forward. The next slide, please. No doubt, with every pandemic, the Jewish people have faced various attempts to apply the cause or factors of the pandemic onto the Jewish experience, meaning that Jews caused or can treat or manage pandemics because they have superpowers. The notion of this idea of the virus and pandemics has deep roots in the blood libel theory and in a host of expressions through the Middle Ages and even through modern Europe, where Jews were charged with creating or causing such events. But here in the United States, at this moment, there are other efforts at exploring or connecting Jews to the virus and its outcomes. Part of it is based on the fact that the ownership of several of the major drug companies in the United States happen to be Jewish. And the notion that the Jewish control or experience with the virus is tied to the ability to deliver or create vaccines that can resolve the virus. So part of this is as much about the contempt for Jews in terms of their economic and influential role in technology, medicine, and drug industries that have led to pieces of this. So the combination of the historic message and the contemporary one have created a kind of current sort of mindset about the role that Jews play in pandemics. The next slide, please. At this moment, I think there are 5 major figures or factors that seem to drive the kind of anti-Semitism we are seeing. One of them is intersectionality. It is tied to critical race theory, but it deserves its own attention here. This is the notion that all victims of history and all current victims share in common their powerless state, their inability to change their circumstance. Therefore, the equation or linkage of victims of American persecution, racism, and behavior are tied to the Palestinians and to other people. And this commonality of victimness is an important piece to the intersectionality notion. That is, all victims are intersected or connected by their common grievances against the majority culture or the political establishment. So in part, this has contributed to some of the anti-Israel practice, but also to attitudes about Jews as being part of the white establishment, which takes us to the second principle here, that whiteness is the new norm. The alt-right, for example, suggests that Jews are seeking to replace whites. So what we heard in Charlottesville in connection with Jews will not replace us is precisely this notion of the replacement theory, that Jews are pretenders as whites who are seeking to have power and influence and replace whites in the control of government, the economy, industry, culture, the arts, and religion. This power of whiteness is also seen on the far left. There it is described in the sense that Jews are pretenders, They are now powerful, no longer minorities, and therefore no longer people who can project themselves as other than white. They have become part of the white establishment and therefore have and are marginalizing other people who are non-whites. So this issue of whiteness has become important as part of the conversation around anti-Semitism from both the left and the right. The third characteristic is tied to events associated with Israel over the past number of years, and this rejectionism of Israel as a colonial state, as an apartheid society, and as trying to play off of a false notion about the Holocaust, that the creation of the state of Israel is directly tied to the Shoah, and therefore needs to be understood that this was a creation of the Jews to create a storyline about the death and destruction of 6 million. So all of this again contributes to this set of current thematic principles: intersectionality, whiteness, Holocaust denial, and Israel rejectionism. We are all aware that in the United States today, there is a new American nationalism. It precedes Donald Trump, but it is certainly very much tied to his presidency. But we see it in various frames and forms. And part of that notion is that to be part of the American national experience, you must be Christian, you must be white, and therefore you must, in a sense, be part of a particular breed of Americans who can and ought to, in a sense, continue to inherit the benefits and beauties of the United States. That other groups are pretenders or seekers who are trying, in a sense, to undermine the changing character of the United States. The reality here is that by the year 2040, the United States will cease to be a white majority society, where we will become a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society, as the numbers suggest, with the rise of Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and others. We see the critically changing population base, which is why this rush back to nationalism is particularly powerful and significant for those who are unable or uncomfortable or unwilling to accept the demographic and political changes taking place. No doubt the pandemic itself has been a factor in the rise of modern and contemporary anti-Semitism. It's been driven by a lot of the economic dislocation, as literally thousands of businesses have closed and millions of Americans have been displaced economically. And that too has contributed to part of the notions about the pandemic itself as a Jewish product, and part of it contributes to the larger picture of hate in America against all other groups, including Muslim Americans, African Americans, and certainly Asian Americans. The trust factor is amongst the most interesting concepts here. Since the 1970s, political scientists have been observing the decline in the American political scene of trust, meaning fewer Americans today believe in the ability of the president, the Congress, the courts, and other institutions that are seen as anchors to our society as being functional, as being valid, as being able to lead. And part of this leadership crisis has contributed to a loss of confidence in these institutions. And that is particularly dangerous because American Jews, for example, are very much engaged with institutions of politics and very much tied to the political process, whereas other groups have become disenfranchised or disconnected from such institutions. And that too has contributed to the downsizing or weakening of belief in the American code of democracy, civility, and engagement. The next slide, please. The latest ADL report, which was issued in 2020, reminds us of the size and scope of the growth of anti-Semitism over the past 7 years. The incidents in 2020 account for a little over 2,000 actual incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault. Here, the numbers are laid out for us. The numbers are significant because they continue to show a pattern of increased violence, if you wish, directed against Jewish audiences, individuals, Jews, institutions of the Jewish community, and the messaging, that is the very idea or ideas associated with Jews, Judaism, and the state of Israel. The next slide, please. More specifically, the Anti-Defamation League and other groups began to measure hate and anti-Semitic and anti-Israel behavior, especially this past spring, during the period of the Gaza conflict with the state of Israel, which occurred between April 26 and May 23rd of this current year. So here you see the data as to the rise of significant amount of hate just during this 1 month period of spring of this year, pointing to the reality that the Israel story is very much a connecting piece to the larger picture of measuring and studying anti-Semitism across the globe. The next slide, please. Also, what we have begun to look at is campus anti-Semitism or hate crimes, much broader than simply attacks on Jews, but attacks on African Americans, Asians, Latinos, Muslims, and others. And we've seen this growth factor just from the 5-year period from 2011 to 2016. I picked that period because we believe that the sort of thrust of the new hate begins roughly in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported to us from 2008 to 2016, the very years that President Obama served in the White House, that we had the highest rates of the rise of groups of white supremacists, the Proud Boys, white action groups that were designed to speak out against the president and to act against the interests of the United States during the period of the Obama presidency. We identified more than 1,000 new hate organizations that developed during the period of the Obama presidency as an example of the kind of hate manifestations we are seeing. Much of this continues even into 2021, especially on college campuses, where white supremacist groups have shown some growth and where other forms of anti-minority group behavior is very much evidenced on our campuses. The next slide, please. But hate in America goes well beyond the Jewish community, as we've already begun to point out. Part of this is the fact that 19 states have introduced voter suppression laws, that there has been and continues to be immigrant bashing, whether by the government at various times over the past number of years, or by individual groups acting as vigilantes against immigrants. And where the third factor, where political discourse itself has become crude and rough, and civility has given way to a huge divide that we see both inside, by the way, the Jewish community, but across the political spectrum in general. And indeed, the physical threats and attacks that I've already demonstrated against Jews are also being very much apprised and presented against other groups in this society. We believe the largest basis for why this growth has occurred between 2014 and 2021 is because of the rise of social media platforms. We see more hate delivered and messaged through these platforms, whether it's Facebook or TikTok or a host of other such formats or platforms, where in fact the rise of misinformation, untruths, racist and anti-Semitic statements and commentaries have created a whole new sort of presence of the new kind of hate in America that has developed over these 6 years. The next slide, please. I think we need to remind ourselves that the accepted or current accepted definition of anti-Semitism has been created and now adopted by a number of countries, including 30 nations, to reflect the sort of commonality or agreement on what anti-Semitism is. The statement that appears in this slide is but part of the broader context prepared by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance to reflect the general attacks or assaults on Jews and on Jewish individuals, on Jewish properties, on the Jewish community and on religious institutions. But it extends beyond that, because the statement and the controversy about this statement includes elements as well with regard to commentaries directed against the state of Israel. So the question that's been raised by some who are deeply concerned about anti-Semitism, but also believe in the rights and freedoms of individuals to be critical of political issues, not the right of a Jewish state, for example, to exist, but the questions associated with whether you are permitted at all to attack the state of Israel over any of its policies and practices. And that has become part of the debate over whether or not the statements associated with this definition are appropriate and adequate in helping to determine what constitutes modern or contemporary anti-Semitism. The next slide, please. The Pew Study, which was released in the spring of 2021, but is based on the work of the Pew organization from 2020, is the second of a series of studies done by Pew on American Jews. The first was done in 2013, but there was no clear reference in 2013 to any major concerns on the part of American Jews about significant increases in anti-Semitism. Here, immediately one sees that 9 in 10 American Jews expressed to the pollsters in this questionnaire and study a growing and indeed deeper concerns and worries about anti-Semitism. And this has been a 75% increase in the 5-year period from the last efforts at monitoring or studying this question. And in total, 53% of American Jews who were surveyed feel less safe in the United States today than they did 5 years earlier. The next slide, please. We know, however, that hate can be found everywhere and at any given time. And as we saw on January 6th, and as we've seen even on the streets of our cities and towns, there have been expressions of hate directed against all kinds of minority groups, including Jewish Americans. But we also, as we've noted in an earlier slide, the power of international and social media in conveying untruths or misrepresentations of information has been the single most powerful forum or force for that. But we also see expressions of hatred and anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic commentaries by governments and forums, including governments and forums that are part, certainly, of the Middle East, of Europe, and elsewhere. And indeed, even the institutions in this country, included in that are college campuses. We accounted last year for 327 incidents on college campuses, a 40% increase of incidents directed against students, whether they were Jewish or others. The fact is that campus life today is bereft or present with huge amounts of potential hate directed against different constituencies. And certainly our own political arena, with its various individual actors, whether on the far left or on the right, have been certainly a part of this conversation or practice of delivering hate speech into the public square. The next slide, please. I think for a moment we need to step back and take a look at what critical race theory may represent. We need to remind ourselves that critical race theory is a legal doctrine that developed in the 1970s and 80s, but has become or has been now being used as a kind of measure of what constitutes appropriate or inappropriate commentary or comments about race in American society. And indeed, part of the notion, of course, is that race is a social construct. And one needs to understand it in that context and to realize the history of the United States as part of having a storyline of racism as much of its historic background. We also need to take into account, according to this theory, that whiteness is an exceptionalism, meaning that being white affords people opportunities that are not always extended or available over the course of American history and experience to other groups, which apply to Jews who were also the benefit or received the benefits of their whiteness at times. Where others were denied certain access, Jews were often the beneficiaries, along with many others. This has become a major conversation piece today as the changing demographics of our society, as I mentioned earlier, are taking place. And indeed, there were efforts during the Trump administration to ban a conversation or the teaching about critical race theory. And there have been other conversations and discussions in particular states about how it should apply in ethnic or cultural studies in terms of ways by which critical race theory is either taught or not taught. And what does it mean for both children and young adults who are people of color, as well as people who have not experienced hate and anti-Semitism and who may be white? The next slide, please. To better understand systematic racism and certainly the issues in American society, I think the reason that critical race theory is receiving the kind of attention that it is now maintaining is tied specifically to the fact that those who are bringing this forward want a different kind of conversation and a different set of actions to be directed in our society to creating a different language or discourse around race, and to better understand the fact that there are huge amounts of discriminatory behaviors that continue to happen, and whether they are always conscious or whether they're always even part of the legal and social systems of our society, the fact is that the conscious levels or the consciousness levels of Americans about race is one of the goals of those who are bringing forward these difficult themes and subject areas. The next slide, please. I think for American Jews and others, where we are today is in part a conversation that needs to happen around American civics and multiculturalism in our educational and community engagements. Precisely because so many Americans have given up on politics or feel a sense of distrust or lack of trust in government and civics, that for many of us who have deeply been bound to these institutions, recreating or encouraging conversations around these topics will be critical. We will also need to continue to pursue the efforts at hate crime legislation and the penalties for those who act out on their anti-Semitic or anti-Black or anti-Muslim behaviors. We will certainly also need to debate the complexities of these issues, whether it's critical race theory or it's Black Lives Matter, or if it's a host of other topics that raise levels of uncomfortability or distress for some of us, but are a part of the necessities of conversation for many others. The old notions of coalitions may need to be reconsidered, ways by which Jews and others align themselves with one another to work through these questions of ensuring the right to vote, of gaining civic access for groups that have been historically denied their appropriate place and role in society, in government, and in education. And in managing certainly conversations about the place of social media and how we either manage social media or deal with closing down those pockets of that industry that continue to violate the interests of bringing forth truth and fairness in these presentations. We are dependent on elites, be they religious or civic, educational, business, or cultural elites. They are essential in representing the interests of minorities, in being a buffer to much of the hate and hate messaging that exists in the society. So these characteristics of civic engagement, hate crime legislation, and a kind of public debate on race in America, the reaffirmation of coalitions, and the framing of ways we deal with the social media discipline are all important and all need to be led by elites who are willing to stand forward and be present in these conversations. The next slide, please. I think the Jewish way forward here is that we are first and foremost concerned about security. That has to be an initial interest. Jewish audiences must be feeling comfortable in order to attend synagogue, to go to JCCs, to place their children in schools and camps, and to be able to function in a world in which Jewish life will thrive and continue to move forward. We are only a few years away from Pittsburgh and Poway and Charlottesville and other experiences, and therefore we deeply know the importance of creating these kinds of security arrangements. Secondly, we need to do a lot of stepping back and retooling. We need to rethink the ways by which we are talking about the subject of race, anti-Semitism, culture in America. With whom are we speaking, and around what can we find common ground? These conversations we will need to have both internally, but beyond the Jewish community, and they will not necessarily be comfortable ones, but it is essential that African Americans and Jews, Latinos and Asians and Muslims all engage in these conversations as part of reframing the storyline of where we do find or could find common ground. Indeed, the discussions in our society are very much divisive, as we all know. And inside the Jewish community, we are looking at a similar model or experience of seeing the deep divides, even in our own community, over subjects such as Israel, even over questions of race and culture, and certainly over religion. These conversations are critical for the Jewish community to have with itself if it wants to also go beyond itself to engage with other institutions, communities, and government. I think the essential issue for minorities in America has always been feeling safe, whether as a community or as individuals. And if we no longer feel that security and safety net, that is a challenge. And that becomes a challenge that we need to convey not only to our leadership, but to the leaderships of the government and beyond, if we intend to see our stake in America as one that is moving forward. I think I've introduced a number of issues tonight, and I hope it will evoke a conversation with each of you. Thank you for your kind attention, and Rabbi, thank you for moving the slides forward during my presentation.
Thanks so much. That was really, really important. So let's open it up and see if people have questions or comments or challenges. Please feel free to go ahead and unmute and go ahead. Ezra, looks like you want to say something.
Well, I guess I disagree with so much that I've heard. But to keep it in a general way, do you not feel that this country is a lot less racist than it was 50 years ago? I go a lot by what I see on, just to take one thing, commercials now. It's hard to see a commercial that is not biracial. And I just think if this were a racist society, that businesses would not be using this form of advertising. And you haven't really mentioned the left at all in your talk. I see BLM as a bigger threat than neo-Nazis to Jews in America. And I'd like to see some examples of ways in which this country is systematically racist. I just think I don't see it at all. I see the problem in the Black community is a lot less racism and a lot more fatherless families. So that's my start.
Thank you for your thoughts and your questions. I think you may have taken some of my comments as if they were my comments. I was introducing to you critical race theory and pointing what the critical race theorists sort of articulate or believe. So that's to first clarify that. Secondly, I did believe that we see both anti-Semitism and racism both on the left and the right. And I think I tried to identify that. There's no doubt, and your first question to me was, is this a country better than it was 50 years ago? There is absolutely no question that there's a heightened sense of awareness that the subject is being dealt with, has been dealt with. But the reality is that for folks who believe that they are still marginalized or minimized, it has not resolved for them many of these core issues. So it's how and where one sits in the American spectrum where I think we often don't find common ground, because folks who believe that they still are experiencing elements of racism and elements of displacement and marginality, for them, this is still a current theme. Black Lives Matter is a complex subject. It's, first of all, Black Lives Matter is not one organization, it's multiple organizations and multiple expressions of where Blacks in America see themselves and how they manage or want to manage these conversations. So I think we cannot sort of take 50 million or 45 million Americans and somehow create a single messaging or single notions about their ideas or their beliefs. I think it's a very complicated set of considerations, which is why American Jews historically engaged African Americans in conversation, worked with them in the civil rights movement, and we need to sort of revisit that place. I think we need to rethink relationships, and that may mean that we will not agree with every one of the goals of some within the Black Lives Movement, but we will certainly find common ground with many of the themes and issues that I think are essential. I believe that we have in this society really two battles to wage. The physical assaults on Jews has come from the right. That is the attack that we have seen very literally in our lives over the last several years. What we see on the left is an array of issues about the society and about American Jews and about Israel. And we have to have a conversation that I think addresses or at least understands why people hold certain views and perceptions about either us or about Israel if we're going to make any ground. Now, I don't agree with the progressives in the Democratic left, but I think to sort of negate them, that is to say they don't represent the majority, and indeed they don't, but they are an important voice. And to the credit of some in our society in metropolitan New York, in greater Chicago, in Minneapolis, there are Jews trying to engage AOC and the other members of the House who sit as part of the squad in an effort to find common ground, even where, as I suggest, we may not agree. But thank you very much for at least opening the conversation and helping us to find our way forward.
Thank you, Steve, for that very measured response. Are there other questions or comments? Rusty, please.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Windmueller, for putting things together, putting so many themes together. I particularly, what I wanted to emphasize as I think particularly insightful and relevant was what you said about intersectionality early in the talk, that there's been, it's often very superficial, but a linkage between victims of persecution in the United States and victims, perceived victims of persecution in Palestine. And so at the UCR campus where I taught until 5 years ago, I could see growing support for motions in the Senate to boycott Israel and to divest UC investments in Israel, being supported by a lot of Latinos and as well as all the Muslims, and so there is this alliance that gets made very quickly, and I think superficially, but we see its influence. And actually, listening to the rest of your talk, I actually got more and more worried because, just one of the most powerful influences you talked about was social media. And we now, under the influence of the pandemic, for the last 18 months, we're all living in this tremendous isolation and just being influenced by media and very little else. And so, see, at UCO on the campus, we haven't had any incidents because we've had no campus life for 18 months. But now that we're reopening, I'm suddenly very frightened. And of course, at the temple, we try to reopen and we put a guard on. Ezra is one of our door guards, by the way. Thank you very much, Ezra. We're very cognizant of the threats to the synagogue now from forces like those you've talked about tonight. So thank you for covering so much of that so swiftly and insightfully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty. Was there a question in there, or was it just kind of?
Sorry, there really wasn't, except, I don't know, just, isn't this a scary time now that, as we reopen, don't we become vulnerable again? That's what I remember.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, which is why it has been important that the governments of the United States and state and local governments have really beefed up the kinds of security arrangements with our institutions. I think that's been particularly critical. And the effective work of the FBI and institutions such as the ADL and other national Jewish groups in monitoring the various hate organizations across the spectrum. And to this point, the ADL has established an office for the first time really in the Bay Area in connection with working with the social media groups, in part because they and we all realize that social media is the conduit where most of these kinds of statements are generated and carried forward. And what I think the goal has been is to impress upon the folks who are the builders of these platforms that it is perfectly fine to carry disagreements, but all arguments and disagreements must be housed or based in truths. And the failure to articulate truth is something that I think is the framework by which we have to continue to press. In a society where freedom of speech is valued, you also need to certainly have accountability for what constitutes responsible discourse. So I'm actually pleased with that initiative by the ADL in regard to this effort. We have a huge amount of work to do. No, this is not Nazi Germany in 1933, but it is an unstable moment in American history. And that we clearly see, because we do not have very much common ground at the moment between and amongst our political elites, and even amongst some of our other core constituencies. And that is troubling, because when there is the failure to find this kind of common framework or common ground, those are the kinds of situations that allow for the rise of really destructive forces that are often anti-Semitic, can be anti-immigrant, as we know, and can certainly be racist in character and nature as well. So it's really very critical that we work to lower the level of the hostility and strengthen the range of commonality or finding common ground.
Steve, I actually have a question on that issue of basing discussion on truth. Our tradition gives us the Talmud with disagreements between various rabbis, the most famous being between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And they disagree, and yet they get married. Their children marry each other. And Rabbi Hillel's school is the one that usually wins out because they're willing to acknowledge the other side before they even talk about their own side. So that's wonderful as a model, except for the fact that they clearly are all basing their discussions on a common truth, on the Torah, on received tradition. And today we have alternative facts, right?
Mhm.
So how do we get to the point where we can actually share a common base of knowledge and truth in order to really have discussions that are healthy? That may be beyond your scope, but I thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the basis of a lot of this. I think that when you pull away some of the conspiratorial theories and notions, and when you get back into talking about the basic sort of core interests of the United States, it's what does it stand for? How has its democracy been constructed, and what are the values that sort of we agree upon, or that we find at least a reasonable commonality? Then I think you can begin to create at least some room for a measured and open conversation. Look, I have found that when I speak with Republicans and Democrats, I find that what the bottom line frequently is they all want for their children and grandchildren a secure society, a society that has access for opportunity for their kids, and a society that seeks to find the common ground rather than the sort of special ground, if you wish, for any one particular group or voice over another. And I think that's the work that needs to be done inside the Jewish community first, and then with other groups as well.
Thank you. Okay, other thoughts, questions, comments?
I have a question. Doctor, what do you think this conversation, there's talk about there should be conversations between Jews and other groups. What are those conversations going to be about?
Well, I think we have to talk about what, for example, what do our cities look like? What should they represent? Because the Jewish community is a very urban society. We tend to live in urban cultures and communities. And most of these other minority communities share that experience with us. So what does the city represent? What does urban life mean for us is certainly one theme. The role of police, the role of law, the role of delivery of core services, including education, healthcare, and these kinds of basic needs and issues are something we all have common considerations for. So I think we start with the very essence of what it may mean to share the city, and how such urban life can thrive and can actually improve.
Well, defunding the police has certainly not done any good.
Well, no one is, at least in the Jewish community, none of the major agencies and organizations of the Jewish community hold to the belief of defunding. And many in the African-American community likewise do not agree with that principle. And I think we have to find ways in which the police are certainly more accountable and more effective, and that some of the burdens and challenges we have placed on policing in America don't really belong to the police. They belong to other disciplines, including social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists, and the healthcare field. We've asked so much more of the police than they are capable or able or trained to do. And that is actually the burden we have to really recreate the definition of what policing in America looks like. The second principle here is that we all don't agree that you necessarily deliver everything from government. This is a combination of a society where you have huge roles for the nonprofit sector, for the for-profit industry, and for government. And we have to recalibrate the relationship of the three sectors. I'm not one who holds to the principle that government has all the answers and can deliver on all of the sort of expectations that people have. And I think that's why I think we desperately need a conversation that doesn't allow for the rhetoric of any one side to sort of dominate, but for sort of the collective will of people to be heard.
Are there any final questions before we say goodnight?
I have one. Doctor, do you think that Jews are beneficiaries of white privilege?
As I pointed out, this is a thesis held in part of the critical race theory conversation. In that context, the argument was that Jews have benefited by the fact that most of us are white from the realities of opportunities that whites enjoy.
Do you believe that?
Do I believe that? I think that there's some truth to parts of that, for sure.
What parts?
The fact that when other groups were discriminated against because of color, Jews had opportunities because they were white. The best example of that is the GI Bill after the Second World War, when many young families, Christian and Jewish, benefited from the GI Bill. But sadly, African-American soldiers returning did not benefit. So that was simply a case in point of the kind of sort of opportunity or privilege.
But that was 70 years ago.
Yes, but I'm giving you.
You think that's still true?
Ezra, you know what? I'm sorry, but I don't think continually challenging Dr. Windmueller is really fair. I mean, he's given us a very, I think, measured presentation, and
I think he can stand up very well for himself. I don't see that I'm in any way abusing him.
No.
I think Ezra needs to read the book Caste. That might help him understand what's going on.
The book what?
Caste, about the fact that there's a caste. The theory is that there's a caste in our society, a caste system in our society where, which makes it much less flexible and malleable and changeable than class. And that
I am familiar with the book, but I disagree.
Harvey has a question. Let's let someone else ask a question. Harvey, go ahead.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering about, there's leaders in different communities, political as well, who have kind of instigated the negativity of a hatred, both, not only against Jews, but Blacks, Hispanics, Asians. And I always see it as they're pointing the finger. It's like they're doing something to make power for themselves, and they don't want anybody else to have that power. So what they're doing is they're flubbing it off on other groups and saying, see, those people are the ones that are causing you the trouble, not us. So you have poor, I lived in the South for a while. So you have poor white people that, wouldn't know a Jew if they saw one, but they are pointing the fingers at other groups for their lack of income, for their lack of whatever. And it seems like that's the issue, really, is there's a basic ugliness where there are certain groups that are benefiting from hatred, from race hatred, and from ethnic hatred. And, that has to be addressed. I think those are the people that really need to be called on and straightened out, and brought to the light of day, that they're the ones that are causing this issue, not, if you're a poor person, let's say a white poor person, and you see a Black person that's driving a nice car and you're resentful, well, it's not the Black person's fault. It's something else going on, your lack of income or your lack of economic opportunity. So, and there are people that are using that on the as a tool. They're using it as a tool to manipulate those people for political gain. And we saw that in the last 8 years, and last 4 years for sure. Anyway, that's all and do you think that how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people who are in power of some sort? Now, I'm not saying all political power. These are other, there's hidden power, there's religious leaders who are looking at that, and they are also using that to their benefit to keep their people under their control by going after the out group. I used to call it the in group and the out group, in the old days.
I mean, I think there's no question that we've seen a lot of data about, especially the disenfranchised whites, undereducated, that is often without full opportunities or full experiences in the American story and the American economy, and looking for ways to find relief, whether they live in the Rust Belt or in Appalachia or in parts of the South. And both political parties at different times have tried to take advantage of those situations and play to those groups. I would tell you that Barack Obama did very well with them in 2008, and Donald Trump did extraordinarily well with them in 2016 and in 2020. This is in part tied to the fact that these people are groping for some way out of their condition or predicament. There's a lot of literature about this whole sort of body politic of white Americans who feel, angry and disenfranchised and disconnected, and are really scared about what the future holds in this country, because as they clearly see that Latinos and African Americans and Asian Americans and others are rapidly becoming part of the majoritarian culture. And so what will it mean for the society? And we haven't done a particularly good job, either political party, and certainly not the major nonprofit institutions in this country, to address the issue of white rage. And that's what it is. And as you said, in its place, there have been elites, whether they're church elites, political ones, business, or other groups that have stepped in to, in a sense, sort of try to galvanize these people for their own interests. But the difficulty will be in the long term, how the nation really responds to them as it has to respond to other constituencies. We are going through such huge changes in the American story in terms of our economy, our culture, our demography, and the role, for example, of religion in American society. And all of that contributes to why I think people are on edge, and why, as you point out, this particular cohort has been particularly sort of malleable, or certainly have been used for political ends by and economic ends by certain groups.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Joan, I muted you just because there was an echo, but if you could unmute yourself and then ask your question.
I think that that Dr. Windmueller answered one of them, when he spoke of the elites and the role that elites would play, what would his definition of elites be? And he sort of just alluded to that, church leaders. But I think we also need to look at celebrities, and our country is very celebrity organized, and people listen to celebrities. So, but I mean, if he has anybody else that he would call the elite. I also wanted to address the term of anti-Semite, Semite. What is Semite? Because in my knowledge that Arab peoples are also Semites. How did that term originate?
Thanks, Joan.
Okay.
That's a great question. In the 1870s, the German historian and political analyst created the term anti-Semitism as the theory of the study of racial hatred against Jews. The particular individual was himself an anti-Semite, and he saw Jews as Semitic in the sense that he did not see them as European. He saw them as other, and the only best way he could describe them would be to be people of the Middle East, Semitic in origin, arguing that, of course, the Jewish people came out of the Middle East and became part of European society, but did not belong to Europe because they were not racially pure, they were not ethnically white, they were not culturally German, and therefore didn't fit the German racial and ethnic and eugenics sort of qualities of Europeans. So his work in this area in the 1870s creates this terminology. And by the way, Jews were referred to in most of the 19th century as Hebrews. If you notice the institutions that were created in the American Jewish community in the 19th century, the Hebrew Union College, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and several other such institutions, because we were seen as that was our biblical and historic sort of identity. The term Jew is fairly much a modern term, and the Germans, certainly under Hitler and under this racist theories phenomenon, began to convert that into terminologies that were part of, sadly, specifically negative themes associated with both anti-Semitism and certainly with the rise of Hitler.
And the elite, the definition of elite, do you want to expand on that?
Well, I mean, I think there are all kinds of elites. I mean, the 5 major categories of elites are in each of the 5 major arenas of American and human society: governance or government, business, civic affairs, meaning the sort of nonprofit sector, the world of American religion, the world of American arts and culture. And I think these are the areas in which we find elites. And the American Jewish community spent a good deal of time from 1930 to 1980 specifically working on the principle that the best way to influence American society around the things that were concerned to American Jews, building a Jewish state, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting for civil rights, fighting for separation of church and state, working toward an economy that was open and available to all to participate. Those kinds of goals were led by Jewish leaders and organizations over the 50-year period to specifically say that elites defined or could define how America could change. And if the Jewish community could not influence millions of people, it could at least have conversations with the head of the AFL-CIO, with the national chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, with the president of the United States, with the leader of the House, with the leader of the Senate, with the leaders of the NAACP and other key racial and ethnic groups, and with leaders of institutions such as educational institutions, the president of Harvard. And through those leadership conversations, you began to articulate these were the interests of American Jews, and these were the values that Jews brought to the society. Because in the 1930s, Jews were very much minimized and marginalized in this country. The rate of anti-Semitism, the discrimination in housing, discrimination in jobs, the quota systems at universities was significant. And what turned a lot of that around was after the Second World War, the ability of these leaders to really make the case that Jews were an integral part of the American story. We fought in the wars of this country. We died to defend the nation. We are part of the civil rights of America. We are part of the human rights of all people. And we began to build this sort of market in which we could articulate some of the interests that we shared with others and that our elites were able to convey and carry forward. So elites are particularly powerful in a society where they are loved, respected, and honored. They do not do us any good if they are marginalized and minimized. And that is what I worry about when I spoke earlier about the decline of trust in institutions and leaders. On that
Thank you
note,
so much. This was great. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for an amazing presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was good. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
very much. And
Take care,
very
all of you.
interesting.
Good
Okay.
night.
And good night to everybody.
And thank you